The hearing will come to order. I would like to start by thanking my colleagues, Representative Castro, the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on International Development, International Organizations, and Global Social Impact, as well as his ranking member, Representative Malliotakis. We thank them for joining the Strategic Forces Subcommittee of HASC to discuss this incredibly important and timely topic. I welcome our distinguished panel of witnesses, both from the Departments of Defense and State, as we dive into the issues surrounding the lack of specific, verifiable international norms for behavior in space. First, we have Mr. John D. Hill, performing the duties of Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy, Lieutenant General Stephen Whiting, Commander, Space Operations Command, United States Space Force, Mr. Jonathan M. Moore, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, Bureau of Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs, Mr. Bruce Turner, the Senior Bureau Official, the Bureau of Arms Control, Verification, and Compliance. Thank you all for participating in today's hearing, and I ask you, as well as all the members, including the chair and ranking, to keep your remarks brief and to no more than 5 minutes so that we can have ample time for the number of members who are on the call to ask questions. Space has captured human imagination since the beginning of time, but it's still a long, long way from being understood by our political leaders, diplomats, and lawyers, at least in a way that the many nations of Earth can agree upon. Now, scientists have made great progress in helping us reach, explore, and even briefly inhabit the harsh domain above us, but the rest of us are much slower to follow or even understand where the scientists are enabling us to travel. Many nations and even some corporations are exploring high above the Earth's atmosphere, testing the infinite number of ways that mastering space can help the 7.6 billion of us who live down here on the Earth. The space age is about 70 years old, and the foundational Outer Space Treaty is just over 50 years old. That should tell us something. Unfortunately, precious little has happened since the OST to organize human efforts in the inhuman space domain. Space is in danger of becoming the wild, wild west, where every satellite, astronaut, cosmonaut, or taikonaut has to defend himself. From their testimony, I see that our State Department experts are giving up on the concept of a law-abiding, rules-based space and settling for something less, like suggestions-based space, or probably even hint-based space. Perhaps that's the best we can do, but I think that we should try harder for better. Can't we at least agree on agreements on space traffic management, on the size of safety zones around satellites or capsules, to ban debris, at least from ASATs, or to have compatible docking latches? There must be a consensus somewhere on Earth for the sensible. I look forward to the discussion with our witnesses, and I turn to today's honorary Strategic Forces ranking member, Mr. Doug Lamborn, for any opening remarks that he may have. Doug?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And I want to thank you, Chairman Castro, and Ranking Member Malliotakis. Additionally, I want to thank our witnesses for joining us today to discuss this important issue. As this subcommittee has highlighted again and again, space is a vital component of our national security now more than ever. Not only that, but our global economy is totally dependent on access to space. Space, like the air and sea domains, is a common good that we all benefit from regardless of country of origin. But unlike those other domains, space is more likely to suffer a tragedy of the commons outcome as a result of bad actors. The physics of space leaves it susceptible to long-term damage from debris created by collisions, poorly conducted anti-satellite weapons and testing, and simply poor planning. The foundation international laws and norms that we're currently operating under were developed under the cloud of the Cold War and when only the two great powers could access space. As a result, the Outer Space Treaty doesn't account for the congested operations of space we see today. This treaty was also written with very broad language and phrases that are open to wide interpretation by signatories to the agreement. I do not believe China and Russia are operating in good faith when it comes to their proposals, as evidenced by the Treaty on Prevention of the Placement of Weapons in Outer Space, sometimes referred to as the No First Placement Treaty, This treaty proposed to ban weapons in outer space, but lacked any mechanism for verification, and also was silent on space debris caused by ASAT testing and rendezvous and proximity operations. Most notably, however, Russia and China are in many ways already weaponizing space, proposing a treaty upon which ratification they would already be in violation of. I was glad to see that the UK submitted a UN resolution to, quote, reduce space threats through norms, rules, and principles of responsible behaviors, unquote, to be considered by the UN General Assembly this summer as in a drive to make space safer and more sustainable. What I don't want is another international treaty that would tie our hands while others blatantly ignore its limitations, like the late Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. I also don't want to see a treaty where the U.S. receives almost no benefits while our adversaries do, like the now dead Open Skies Treaty. So I appreciate the continued service and experience that you all provide to the nation, and I look forward to our discussions today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lamborn. Now I turn to the Chairman Castro for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you all. It's an honor to be here today with my colleagues from both committees to discuss one of the long-term challenges we face, not just as a nation, but as a species, space. Specifically, the rules that will govern humanity's exploration, commerce, and other activity within space, both by the private sector and nation states. I give special thanks to Chairman and Congressman Jim Cooper. He's chairman of the subcommittee on strategic forces, which oversees many of our nation's space programs, for working together with the House Foreign Affairs Committee and my staff on this important and historic joint hearing. In the long run, the peaceful exploration of space can be one of the most significant and unifying projects that our nation and our world has ever undertaken. As President Kennedy said of the moon mission, America's journeys to space, quote, will serve to organize and measure the best of our energy and skills. In short, spacefaring can bring out the best in us, leading to cutting-edge technologies, creating new jobs, making significant scientific discoveries, and perhaps, above all, uniting our divided nation behind a common purpose once more. I commend the Biden administration for pledging to continue ongoing plans to return Americans to the moon, and making clear part of this mission will be to land the first woman and person of color on the lunar surface, ensuring that this moon landing will be seen by Americans and the world as an accomplishment on behalf of all Americans. Yet, despite the goal of peaceful coexistence among the stars, space is not immune to the realities of international relations in a time of rising authoritarian powers, or to the global trend of increasing inequality and lack of corporate accountability. This hearing will serve to assess the current and future state of human activity in space and to inform a new American strategy for preserving the rule of law, peace, and international cooperation in the most hostile environment humanity inhabits. This is new territory, of course, for all of us. There's never been this many state and private actors all operating in space at once, with multiple different priorities and growing risks of clashes, both intentional and not. In many ways, the challenge in space is unlike any that humanity has faced before. It took centuries to shape the law of the sea, drawing upon thousands of years of human seafaring. We don't have 100 years to set the rules for space, nor do we have traditions to draw upon that fall beyond living memory. The reality is that space is already critical to the military capabilities of the United States, our allies, our partners, and our adversaries. The question is how we and other states will respond, and whether we will be able to develop a set of rules to manage disputes and develop a set of rules that will also work for all of us. The United States has engaged on these critical issues for decades at the United Nations and in other international organizations. The accelerating pace of human activities in space raises the urgency of re-engaging with our partners and establishing norms and rules. Earlier this week, the United States made a public declaration of what our nation's interests are in space, what threats we face, and how we will engage with the international community to establish norms of behavior. This is a critical task. We rely on space for almost everything we do as a society, to include navigation, accurate timekeeping, global communications, and weather. The number of satellites in space from both government and private actors will increase nearly tenfold in the next decade. Countries, including China, are developing the capabilities to disable or destroy satellites in space through missiles, other satellites, cyber attacks, or electronic warfare. And as the United States plans our return to the moon, that also raises the importance of minimizing the risk to astronauts in space. Congress must pay careful attention to all these issues and determine where the United States will stand on these crucial questions for space governance. This hearing will be one of the Foreign Affairs Committee's first significant opportunities to address these issues and to hear directly from the administration on what we're doing to build an international rules-based order to govern space that can meet the challenges of humanity's second spacefaring century. With that, I yield back, Chair.
Thank you so much, Chairman Castro. Now we turn to Ranking Member Malliotakis for her remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Cooper. As we set out to contribute to the development of a framework for rules-based order in space that serves American interests, there are two primary areas I wish to explore with our panel of government witnesses from the Department of Defense and State. First, my distinguished colleagues have already made reference to the impact of the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, but it is the common heritage of humankind principle captured in the second preambular paragraph of the treaty, quote, recognizing the common interest of all humankind in the progress of the exploration and use of outer space for peaceful purposes, unquote, that I wish to highlight. This principle of international law holds that just as we are to treat our seas on Earth, outer space should be free for exploration and use for the benefit of all and shall be the province of all humankind. Further, it means outer space should be free from exploitation by any nation, state, or private corporation. I draw this out because we have seen the principle in practice under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, also known as UNCLOS. It was established to set out a comprehensive legal regime for the world's oceans. Despite being a party to this convention, China has acted without regard to its terms, even going so far as to ignore an international tribunal ruling that rejected the legality of China's maritime claims and behaviors from 2016. And nearly 5 years later, there has been no punitive action taken against China, and still China continues to act in contravention of the Law of the Sea Convention. Last month, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence issued its annual report of worldwide threats to U.S. national security, which includes sections on the threat of Russia and China's space programs. The report reflects the collective insights of the U.S. intelligence community and focuses on the most direct, serious threats to the United States during the next year. The report identifies China and Russia's anti-satellite weapons program and the threat these programs pose to U.S. terrestrial forces that rely on satellite-based communications. I share in the concerns conveyed by my armed services colleagues on the threat posed by China and Russia's space technology to the principle of common heritage of all humankind. Both nations' track records on the Earth's surface give more than sufficient reason to expect that their malign behavior will extend into orbit. The second aspect I wish to highlight is the commercial exploration of space. I marvel and join my colleagues in enthusiastically supporting the participation between NASA and commercial space exploration. The April 23rd launch of SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket from NASA's Kennedy Space Center, which propelled an international team of astronauts, Crew Dragon, in the endeavor to the International Space Station, is a perfect illustration of just how far we have come in space exploration. As with the safe return of the Crew 1 astronauts on the 2nd, while the U.S. government builds partnerships with private industry for China and Russia, there is no distinction between that which is state-owned and that which is privately owned, as their respective space programs are all state-owned. By extension, their programs serve both civil and military purposes. We have seen this script before in the Pacific waterways, where commercial fishing vessels are also used by China as maritime militia. And focused on these two areas, the principles of the heritage of humankind and commercial space exploration, because of Because on one hand, they offer us opportunities to abiding nation states and future generations, but on the other, they represent dangerous risks resulting from nation states unwilling to be bound by a rules-based order and pursuing space technology that pose a direct threat to our nation's security. In our discussion, we must not cast aside these realities. When world leaders negotiated the terms of the Outer Space Treaty in the days of the original Star Trek series, maintaining status was attainable. But today, as our global leaders pursue international norms, rules, and principles of responsible behavior in outer space, it's now fiction. The U.S. and other nation states may abide by international norms, rules, and principles of responsible behavior, but our competition acts with indifference to the same rules-based order. This is our current operating environment, and we must pursue a space policy that brings together our interests, but also addresses these challenges in space exploration. I welcome our esteemed panel of experts and yield the remainder of my time, which I suppose I ran out. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Representative Maliotakis. First, let me say that everyone should be muted except for the witnesses that I call on. So let me repeat, everyone should be muted. There's way too much background noise here. So please mute yourself. Our first witness for his 5-minute statement will be Mr. John Hill. Now, Mr. Hill.
Thank you, Chairman Cooper, Ranking Member Lambourne, Chairman Castro, and Ranking Member Maliotakis, distinguished members of the subcommittees. It's an honor to testify before you today along with my distinguished colleagues. You have my full written statement, and with your permission, I ask that it be included in the record. I will briefly summarize it.
Without objection, so ordered.
The U.S. government efforts to foster a rules-based international order in outer space are focused on establishing voluntary, non-legally binding measures derived from current technical and operational best practices. As one of the world's most experienced space operators, the Department of Defense actively supports and partners with the Department of State in developing U.S. proposals within international venues in order to shape the strategic environment toward an agreed-upon model for safe, responsible, and professional behavior. There are many benefits to having common guidelines for space operations. Among these are a safer, more sustainable, more stable, and more predictable space operating environment for all space operators. Importantly for DoD, such an operating environment can also facilitate indications and warnings of hostile intentions and hostile acts. DoD policies and practices often serve as the basis for international measures. DoD models responsible behavior through our routine space operations, and DoD works carefully to ensure that our space operations are consistent with international measures the United States supports and with relevant domestic and international law, including the law of armed conflict and the inherent right of self-defense. For example, not only are DoD operations fully consistent with the 2007 Space Debris Mitigation Guidelines of the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, but DoD practices also served as a source of the more rigorous standards adopted in the November 2019 United States Government Orbital Debris Mitigation Standard Practices. Likewise, for 10 years, the Department of Defense provided one of the lead U.S. delegates to the negotiations on the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space that produced the 2019 guidelines for the long-term sustainability of outer space activities. This participation ensured consistency with DoD practices and greatly facilitated implementation of these guidelines. Most recently, DoD has supported the drafting of the United States National Submission in response to the 2020 United Nations General Assembly resolution on reducing space threats through norms, rules, and principles of responsible behaviors. From the DoD perspective, United States leadership in the development of a rules-based order for space activities reaps benefit for U.S. civil, commercial, scientific, and national security space operators. As space activities worldwide become more prolific and more varied, voluntary, non-binding international norms, standards, and guidelines of responsible behavior can benefit U.S. national security and foster a conducive environment for growing global space activities. Thank you for your time and attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hill. I appreciate that. I think I ask members one more time to please mute your microphones. There is still some background noise. And now we will hear from General Whiting.
Chairman Cooper, Chairman Castro, Ranking Member Lamborn, Ranking Member Malliotakis, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today in my capacity as Commander, Space Operations Command, on the U.S. Space Force perspectives toward creating a framework for rules-based order in space. I'm honored today to join Mr. Hill and our partners at the State Department, Mr. Turner and Mr. Moore, whose leadership and insights greatly contribute toward ensuring the safety, security, stability, and long-term sustainability of U.S. space activities. I have the distinct privilege to lead and represent Guardians and Airmen of Space Operations Command, providing combat-ready, ISR-led, cyber-secure space and combat support forces to the Joint Force. It is from the perspective of our role to generate, present, and sustain these forces that I testify here before you today. Now, aligned under our nation's newest service, our mission is to protect America and our allies in, from, and to space, now and into the future. As U.S. Space Command's Space Force Service Component, we accomplish this mission through our headquarters Generate, Present, and Sustain tasks, along with SPOC West, a headquarters we present to U.S. Space Command at Vandenberg Air Force Base in California, who plan, integrate, conduct, and assess global space operations. Our mission execution benefits from decades of experience operating in space while demonstrating safe, professional, and responsible behavior. In fact, given our imperative to help keep the domain safe, our command, in partnership with what was our combatant command at the time, U.S. Strategic Command, and today is U.S. Space Command, has for many years, with the support of Congress, been providing orbital conjunction assessments to any space owner and operator around the globe, while also making available spacetrack.org to foster openness and transparency in the tracking of tens of thousands of objects on orbit. As more actors come to space, the domain is changing, with an increased risk of collisions, as well as miscalculations or misunderstandings. It is incumbent on the department to continue space leadership through demonstrating and acknowledging responsible behavior in space, such as the widespread sharing of space situational awareness information. Today, we support the shift of non-military space traffic management to the Department of Commerce, thus allowing the Department of Defense to focus on directed military functions in our protect and defend mission. Nevertheless, the U.S. Space Force will collaborate with the Department of Commerce by providing the authoritative space catalog and in identifying and analyzing specific behaviors to ensure safe, professional, and sustainable operations on orbit, while further enhancing trust with allies and establishing new bonds with emerging spacefaring nations. However, we have long understood that our nation is strongest economically, militarily, and diplomatically when we have freedom of operation in a secure, stable, and accessible space domain. It is the position of the U.S. Space Force that the voluntary, non-legally binding, transparency, and confidence-building measures, guidelines, and norms on responsible behavior, to include an understanding of what constitutes safe and professional conduct, would be immensely helpful toward our mission to protect the U.S. and our allies in, from, and to space. In concert with the Secretary of State's leadership of the whole of government approach to establish norms, the U.S. Space Force provides Department of Defense a capability to both model that behavior and promote internationally accepted standards. I thank you for your support, and I look forward to working with Congress as we continue to transform our national security space posture. Again, I'm privileged to be here with my distinguished colleagues and look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, General Moore. General Whiting. Now we will hear from Mr. Moore.
Thank you very much, Chairman Cooper,
Ranking Member Lamborn, Chairman Castro, Ranking Member Maliotakis, distinguished members of the subcommittees. I'm very honored to join you and my colleagues from the Pentagon, Space Command, and the State Department to discuss American leadership in outer space. You have my full written testimony, which I would ask if you would kindly submit for the record. And of course, I'll keep my remarks to less than 5 minutes, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, so ordered. Yeah.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. So thank you very much for the impressive senior bipartisan interest in this vastly important issue. As we all know, and many of you have noted, human activity in outer space is changing rapidly and is of both interest and importance to the American people. In 1990, only about 20 countries were active in space. Today, it's more than 70. The United States leads the world in new commercial space ventures. For the first time in nearly a decade, and this is a tremendous and inspiring success, and thanks to the private sector, Americans are traveling to the International Space Station on American-made space launch vehicles. The success of our national space program increasingly depends on international engagement and therefore depends on diplomacy. The Bureau of Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs, together with the Bureau of Arms Control Verification and Compliance, conducts diplomatic efforts to ensure that the behavior across all space sectors is consistent with US policy and practice, as well as with the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which a number of you have cited, and associated conventions and agreements. The Biden-Harris administration has charged us to explore and use outer space to the benefit of humanity and ensure the safety, stability, and security of outer space activities. This includes expanding and leveling the global playing field for the American space industry. We work directly with partners and through UN bodies and other multilateral fora to advance these principles. Key among these are the UN Committee for the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, mentioned before, COPUOS, as well as the UN Office for Outer Space Affairs. For over 60 years, we have worked through those organizations to build support for the United States space policies, and as well as for our vision to expand human presence in space and promote the responsible use of space. As Chairman Castro noted, in February, the Biden administration endorsed NASA's Artemis program, an ambitious effort to land the first woman and first person of color on the moon, and establish long-term human presence there, as well as develop and demonstrate new technologies, capabilities, and business approaches needed for future exploration activities, and go on to Mars. Decades ago, the Apollo missions galvanized world attention, but the costs were borne by the American taxpayer. Now, through cooperation with international partners and private industry, we share both the burden and the rewards. The Artemis Accords, created by the Department of State and NASA in consultation with some of our close spacefaring partner nations, are this generation's recommitment to the principles of the Outer Space Treaty, envisioning a safe and transparent, peaceful and prosperous environment which facilitates exploration, science, and commercial activities in space. As my fellow panelists have testified, there will be major geopolitical challenges as other countries advance their own space exploration objectives. Some countries will work with us to establish and adhere to standards of safe and responsible behavior. Others will not. Our Bureau, OES, keeps a very close eye on Russian and Chinese space activities. Together with the interagency, we engage directly with them on spaceflight safety and responsible behavior while countering actions inconsistent with those principles. U.S. cooperation with Russia is based on a governmental agreement on cooperation in the exploration and use of outer space for peaceful purposes, which was recently extended through December 31st, 2030. This arrangement provides a legal framework for cooperation on the International Space Station and limited space science and robotic space exploration missions. With regard to China, we maintain our engagement through a variety of means in order to understand their space science and exploration programs and encourage mutually beneficial open exchange of scientific data from civil space missions. Please just let me underline, American diplomatic leadership is establishing international frameworks and facilitating norms of behavior based on United States policy and practice. Advancing peaceful norms and responsible behaviors in outer space is critical to protecting American national security, commercial, and research interests. The Department of State, in coordination with the Interagency and National Space Council, as well as in close consultation with Congress, will continue to utilize multilateral venues
initiatives such as the Artemis Accords, as well as bilateral consultations to support U.S. interests in commercial space activity, responsible behavior in outer space, and space exploration. Thank you again for inviting us to testify. I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moore. And now, Mr. Turner.
Chairman Castro, Chairman Cooper, Ranking Member Maliotakis, and Ranking Member Lombard, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the rules-based space order. I am grateful for the opportunity to testify along John Hill, Lieutenant General Stephen Whiting, and Jonathan Moore. Like others, I have submitted a longer statement for the record. It is incredibly appropriate that we are meeting on May 5th, the 60th anniversary of astronaut Alan Shepard's flight in Freedom 7. This suborbital flight was the first step that gradually led to American astronauts orbiting the Earth, landing on the Moon, and today traveling in continuous orbit around our planet. This flight took place in a time when there were only 2 countries placing satellites and humans in orbit. It also took place in a time when the legal regime regarding outer space was just beginning to be developed. The development and implementation of arms control agreements is one of the main concerns of the State Department's Bureau of Arms Control Verification and Compliance, known as AVC, which I am representing today. In that capacity, along with our state and DoD colleagues, we are leading efforts for the development and implementation of voluntary, non-legally binding measures to enhance the safety and security of outer space. In general, consistent with longstanding bipartisan policy, and as reflected most recently in the 2020 National Space Policy, the United States will consider proposals and concepts for arms control measures if they are equitable, effectively verifiable, and enhance the national security of the United States and its allies. Unfortunately, for many years, the international community has been focused on a number of flawed, legally binding arms control proposals, including most recently the 2014 Russo-Chinese Draft Treaty on the Prevention of the Placement of Weapons in Outer Space and of the Threat or Use of Force Against Outer Space Objects, known as PPWT. The draft PPWT fails the test laid out in the U.S. National Space Policy, and the State Department has a long record of enumerating its many flaws. In light of these shortcomings, the 2020 National Space Policy directs the United States government, and I quote, to lead the enhancement of safety, stability, security, and long-term sustainability in space by promoting a framework for responsible behavior in outer space, including the pursuit and effective implementation of best practices, standards, and norms of behavior, end quote. President Biden's 2021 interim strategic national security guidance also affirms that the United States will lead in promoting shared norms and in forging new agreements in outer space. The United States believes that the development and implementation of norms of behavior can reduce risks to international security and stability through increasing predictability, enhancing operational safety, and reducing risks of misperceptions, thereby contributing to the prevention of conflict. That is why in 2020, the United States worked with our close allies to advance a new United Nations General Assembly resolution titled Reducing Space Threats Through Norms, Rules, and Principles of Responsible Behaviors. We believe this resolution can serve as the first step of a process to describe the threats to space systems, to develop ideas for responsible behaviors designed to manage perceived threats and risks to space systems, and to consider the establishment of channels for direct communications to manage perceptions. As such, it provides a pragmatic alternative to flawed Russian and Chinese arms control proposals, and many agree with that approach. The resolution was adopted by the UN General Assembly this last fall with 164 votes for and only 12 against, among them Russia, China, Iran, Syria, North Korea, Cuba, and Venezuela. On May 3rd, 2021, pursuant to the resolution's call for reports on proposed next steps, the State Department submitted our government's views to the UN Secretary General. Mr. Chairman, for many years, the international community has been focused on flawed, legally binding space arms control proposals at a time when the outer space environment has grown in complexity and become contested. It is time for a new approach, primarily focused, at least for now, upon voluntary, non-legally binding norms, rules, and principles of responsible behavior in space. Developing and implementing these sorts of measures can help create a safer, more stable, and predictable space environment for all space actors. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the committee's questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Turner. Would like to thank all the witnesses, and now we will turn to member questions. I will begin with myself, but I only have 2 questions, and I would encourage all members to keep it as brief as possible because we have a large number of members on the WebEx call today. First question, you ended your statement, Mr. Turner, and all the witnesses seconded this theme of voluntary, non-legally binding efforts in this regard. So it seems like we've given up on the idea of ropes or any punishment, but we're just going for spider webs instead. So is that the best we can do? Is that a way to get people to be in a more cooperative frame of mind? Do we need more than that?
Thank you, sir, for that question. I think we are trying to make the best out of what is possible at this given moment in time. Certainly, we do not exclude the possibility of legally binding treaties down the road, but that's not where we are given the kinds of competition posed by Russia and China, as has been discussed by some of the speakers. So we are starting with an approach where you can maybe start building with like-minded countries to develop these norms, get them to practice these norms, create peer pressure so that these norms will also be respected by others, and maybe over time develop more far-reaching measures. Thank you.
Thank you. My next question would be for General Whiting. We've talked about transferring space traffic management out of the Air Force for some time. It seems to have taken years. I'm hopeful that the Space Force will be able to get it done on a more timely basis, because I don't want the spacefaring nations to turn to other nations for their clear guidance on what possible collisions might take place. So how quickly can we get the Department of Commerce to pick up this ball and run with it?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for that question. Of course, we are eager to work with the Department of Commerce, and we found them to be an organization that is eager to take this work on. And so we're working diligently to do that because we do care deeply about the safety and security of the domain, which is why we've made SpaceTrack.org available as we have over the years. My understanding is now that they have received resources to work toward this goal, we are working with them over the next couple of years to transfer that work. They have been partnered with us at our operating locations, such as at Vandenberg Air Force Base, and we look forward to continuing that. I can't speak to exactly what their timeline is, but we're eager to get this transferred in the next couple of years.
Thank you very much. I'll now turn to Mr. Lambourne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hill, Mr. Whiting, in your opinion, has space already been weaponized by countries like China and Japan? And what do you make of the satellites that reportedly shadow other satellites?
Congressman Lambourne, yes, we have seen a weaponization of space from China and Russia. If we point back to 2007, really the inflection point in the 21st century, where from the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union around 1990 until 2007, many of those threats that had come up in space in the Cold War had gone fallow. But in 2007, we saw the Chinese conduct a very irresponsible test. We continue to have about 3,000 pieces of debris on orbit that we continue to track. That's about 10% of the total amount of objects that we track on orbit still from that test 14 years ago. We continue to see the Chinese building satellites like the Shijian 17, which is a Chinese satellite with a robotic arm that could be used to grapple U.S. or allied satellites. We know they have multiple ground laser systems which could blind or damage our satellite systems. In addition, Russia has several ground-based lasers that could jam or blind our satellites, and it's probable they'll field more later this decade. We know the Russians have probable prototype anti-satellite weapons on board, including Cosmos 2519. which is a Russian on-orbit weapons system, which has birthed out a subsequent Inspector satellite, and then we've seen a subsequent second object, so 3 total come out of that, Cosmos 2519, and we believe that that second object is a projectile. And then we saw Cosmos 2542, which was launched in late 2019, which appears to be a similar prototype weapon to Cosmos 2519, which was synchronized in its orbit with a United States government satellite. And when the United States government moved our satellite, the Russian Cosmos 2542 resynchronized its orbit. Russia's a sophisticated space actor, so they must have known what they were doing. And obviously, we do not support weapons tests near our satellites. And then finally, Russia has a Nudol ground-based missile designed to destroy satellites in low Earth orbit. But let me be clear, even with this weaponization of space, we do not want a war to extend into space, and we want to do everything possible to deter that.
Thank you. I appreciate that, General Whiting. Mr. Turner, I'm going to finish with you. In late 2019, and that we've already touched on this, Russia launched a satellite that then deployed a sub-satellite that proceeded to synchronize its orbit with a U.S. government satellite. And it's not the first time the Russians have done this. Had the Russians been told that this behavior is unacceptable, and if so, what was their response? Mr. Turner.
Yes, sorry, it took me a second to turn my sound button on. Yes, we have met with the Russians about some of these issues. Most of the discussions we have are less than satisfactory. Sometimes the Russians do not even want to acknowledge that certain activities are indeed taking place. We have done our best to bring experts, military and diplomatic experts, to some of these meetings to discuss these issues, but thus far, the Russians really have not engaged in a satisfactory way.
Okay, and then finally, have there been any other international discussions with the Russians and Chinese or others defining standards of behavior for rendezvous and proximity operations? Mr. Turner.
I don't know, not to my knowledge, actually. I mean, as we were saying, all of us, I think, in our statements, we are just at the beginning of this process to start to define what some of these norms of behavior are, which would, we hope, define such things as how much space to leave between bodies out in space, and how one might approach them. There would be communications, there would be notifications, a number of things like that. But we are just at the beginning of this process now.
So no direct communications with the Chinese on this, even though there have been some preliminary discussions with the Russians.
I would urge you to I think our DoD colleagues would have a better fix on that kind of a question. So,
General Whiting, very quickly, my time's almost gone.
Yeah, Mr. Congressman, I am not aware of any discussion with the Chinese, but I certainly would defer to Mr. Hill.
Congressman Lamborn, if you like, we do not in the Defense Department have direct engagements with China regarding space. There's some very clear statutory limitations on DoD's interactions with China, as with Russia these days.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I apologize. This is Jonathan Moore at State. I have a bit more of an answer for the ranking member, if I may offer it, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, go ahead.
We do engage with China on outer space through both bilateral and multilateral channels. Our primary goal is to ensure spaceflight safety and responsible behavior in outer space. We've been working to try to encourage China to improve communications between our respective satellite operators to avoid potential collisions in orbit. An example of this, we've been coordinating with China to ensure that their navigation satellite system, Beidou, does not cause radio frequency interference with our GPS satellites, and we're trying to encourage interoperability for civil users. We do have discussions. China is not part of the Artemis Accords. We do, however, expect them to follow the norms and standards. We have been clear with them about that, as has been referred to in a different context by my colleague Bruce Turner. The results have certainly not been consistent or satisfactory. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. Now, Chairman Castro.
Thank you, Chairman. I have a question about the Artemis Accords for the panel. The Artemis Accords, negotiated by the last administration and endorsed by the Biden administration, represent a significant step forward in shaping norms for behavior in space and in bringing our allies and partners to work with us on the return to the moon. It's also the first time since the Apollo programs where a new administration maintained the goals of the previous administration, a sign of continuity that raises the chances the Artemis program succeeds. So are the accords intended to exceed pre-existing agreements and treaties? In practicality, what is the binding effect of these accords for their signatories? What role will the Artemis Accords play as a vehicle for establishing norms for behavior in space? And then finally, so far, 9 countries have signed the Artemis Accords, including Canada, the UK, Australia, Japan, Italy, Ukraine, and the UAE. Do you expect other countries to join? And what steps is the administration taking to expand support for the Accords?
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for that question. When we first started working with our colleagues in NASA and in the previous administration on the concept of the Artemis Accords, there was some discussion about making them legally binding. As that discussion continued, particularly with our spacefaring partners, it became clear that legally binding arrangements would also require parliamentary ratification and could take an extremely long time to negotiate. So the Artemis Accords instead, as previously drawn up and very much endorsed by the Biden-Harris administration, as you have stated, are not legally binding. They are mutual statements of values and vision for cooperation in space, neither legally binding nor, for that matter, do they have direct financial implications. With regard to who has signed on to the Artemis Accords, you were exactly right, Mr. Chairman. 9 countries have signed on to them so far. We are engaged in active discussions with a number of other countries that are quite interested in signing on throughout the world. This is a project that affects every continent where there are populations. Many countries, whether they are long-term allies or new friends and partners, are very interested in joining us in a transparent effort to set values and standards in space.
All right. Anyone else? No? Okay. I yield back, Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman. Ranking Member Maliotakis.
Thank you very much. I have a more general question. I'm just curious to know how the State Department and Department of Defense coordinate on space-related activities, particularly when it relates to our partners, allies, and adversaries. It's more of a broad question, but I was just looking for more insight.
I don't mind starting this ball rolling. Of course, the State Department has the lead role in basically in foreign policy outreach. In the case of the AVC Bureau, we are very active in a number of multilateral organizations where we will present our views, because we have to do that competitively with others, and for instance, in the UN framework or in the Conference on Disarmament or in any number of other fora. And we have, of course, regular consultations with our NATO allies, with our Asian allies. And this is what our job is basically about, is to go around and talk to people and build support for the way we want to do things. And the United States is very fortunate to have a very broad network of allies, which allows us to leverage our efforts and multiply them in a way that is generally not available to countries such as Russia and China. So that is where the United States has a distinct advantage. And that's where, consulting with our allies and building support for everything we do is really one of the most effective ways that the United States can achieve the kinds of goals that we've been talking about today. And of course, every step we take is, even though we may have the lead on these foreign policy issues, the only other thing I would like to say is that all of these activities, especially involving arms control and some of these issues, security issues, are what we do is the result of a very intensive interagency process that brings in all the different players, the intelligence community, joint staffs, OSD, et cetera, NASA, depending on what is being discussed and what is at stake. So it's quite an intensive process.
And for the Department of Defense end, just
yes, Yes, Representative Maliotakis, I'd be glad to give you some concrete examples of how DoD really we're typically supporting State Department in these cases because you're talking here mainly about diplomacy of the nation, and that's State Department's lead. But for example, Mr. Turner mentioned the talks, the civil space talks that his office has with China, and he mentioned the example of the global positioning system. So we will provide a DoD technical expert to support him because, of course, the Department of Defense operates the global positioning system, and we will provide that technical expert to support talks related to spectrum and deconfliction and so forth in that respect. Another example would be last summer, the United States and Russia met in Vienna in the context of a space security exchange there. This was related to some other talks that were going on. Of course, State Department led it and organized it, but Department of Defense, we sent one of General Whiting's colleagues, General Shaw, was there from the operational side. I participated from the policy side, and we were able to present defense perspectives and space and diplomatic perspectives relative to the positions Russia was taking and some of the Russian behavior that we find problematic. Third example would be this United Kingdom resolution that passed in the General Assembly and the United States response to it. Again, we cooperated very closely in how the United States will put together the position. So State Department could be confident that what they were carrying forward was something that was good for the national security from our perspective here, as well as good from the broader perspectives that they have to represent across the breadth of the government.
Great. I'm running out of time, but if you can fit it in, just curious, any thoughts, the Russia and China announcing their intentions to jointly develop a research station on the moon, and any concerns that Congress should be aware of on that end?
I can comment that we will keep a close eye on that. And that's probably the most I can comment at this point. Thank you.
Understood. Thank you.
The gentlelady's time has almost expired.
I yield back. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The order of questioning for the next four members will be Mr. Langevin, Mr. Wilson, Mr. Garamendi, and Mr. Issa. Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses for testifying today. Appreciate your contributions to this discussion. Let me begin. Several think tanks have already noted that cyber, electromagnetic spectrum, and directed energy attacks are growing threats for space-based assets. Mr. Turner and Mr. Moore, to what extent have these topics been discussed regarding standards of responsible state-based behaviors? Mr. Turner, I'm going to start with you.
The report that we gave. Yeah, what we have done, I mean, in the report that we just sent to the United Nations, some of the issues. No, that's not it. We have listed a number of the different kinds of threats that to space, and to date there are no standards for those threats at all. I mean, these systems are being developed. There are no international rules to govern them. But as part of our contribution, we had a whole section describing the kinds of threats that are out there. You know, ground to space, space to space, ground to ground, space to ground, and we talked about radio frequency interference, directed energy weapons, cyber threats to command and control, attacks on terrestrial space infrastructure, ASAT missiles, which were discussed earlier, robotics, etc. So what we're at the stage of the process where we are identifying the kinds of threats that are out there, and then eventually this will lead them to principles of behavior for how nations should behave in space. But there are no formal agreements covering a number of these issues.
Good. Mr. Moore, any comment from you? You're on mute, I think.
Thank you, Congressman Langevin. Bruce Turner's team in AVC focuses more on the security side. We focus more on the civilian side of trying to set the standards and enforce U.S. interests. So I apologize, I do not have more for you on that.
Okay. Okay, well, let me ask you this. With respect to cyber, we already have norms related to the targeting of critical infrastructure. I'd be curious to hear quickly from all the witnesses, would you support designating space as a critical infrastructure sector? And I ask this because DHS is currently doing a congressionally mandated review of critical infrastructure sectors.
I could step in here briefly. And first, I'd like to clean up something I said previously. I referenced the civil talks. That's Mr. Moore's office, of course, not Mr. Turner's office that leads the civil talks. I misspoke previously. On this one, with respect to the critical infrastructure question, my understanding is that space has been included as a critical infrastructure in the homeland security context. And there are individual defense assets that are maybe also included as defense critical infrastructure.
Okay, I wasn't aware of that designation, but we'll take that one and double check on.
And we will too.
I think it certainly should be designated as critical infrastructure. So understanding that you have to be able to adequately monitor the environment to enforce responsible behavior. General Whitberg, how would you assess our space situation awareness and attribution capabilities? And actually, before I go to that, do any of the witnesses other thoughts on designating space as critical infrastructure? I would assume you would agree.
Congressman, if I may offer a view, that is worth taking a more deeper look at. I'm not certain that space has been designated as a critical infrastructure sector. Obviously, the question of cybersecurity is of paramount interest to the Biden-Harris administration, and many of us at the State Department are working on that, perhaps our bureau somewhat more peripherally. But in terms of space as a critical infrastructure sector, we would have to review that and get back to you.
Fair enough. Yeah, I see my time's about to expire. Anything else from the other witnesses on critical infrastructure?
Mr. Congressman, nothing on the critical infrastructure piece, but if you'd like, I'll briefly talk about our space situational awareness, or as we call space domain awareness capabilities. We have the best in the world, and that's why we make available so much of that information through spacetrack.org to promote a safe, stable, and secure space domain. But with the growing threats that I spoke to earlier, we need to improve that domain awareness capability so that we could help to know when any future norms are being violated, and certainly from our perspective, watch for threats and give good indications and warning of potential bad actors in space.
Very good.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Wilson.
Thank you very much, Chairman Jim Cooper and Ranking Member Doug Lamborn, for coordinating this very important joint hearing. Additionally, I'd like to thank the four witnesses. Each one of you have come across as very impressive, and your service to our country is very, very much appreciated. In terms of questions, General Whiting, what progress has been made in operationalizing our international space partnerships through the Combined Space Operations Center?
Mr. Congressman, thank you for that question. We've made some substantial progress through the Combined Space Operations Initiative. We now have allied personnel across many of our formations to include the Combined Space Operations Center at Vandenberg. And U.S. Space Command, our combatant command, in fact, now has a named Operation Olympic Defender, which some of those countries have signed up to, which means we operate day-to-day in space with them. And our CSPOC at Vandenberg works with their national military space operations centers on a daily basis. So that unique pairing of countries that we are blessed to have, that's really an advantage for the United States, and we're excited about that progress.
I share your view about being blessed. And in regard to that, what are the leading countries that are cooperating?
It's some of our closest allies, Mr. Congressman, like Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and others.
Well, again, best wishes on that. And Mr. Hill, expanding commercial space infrastructure is uniquely American solution to increasing our capability of resilience. I'm impressed with the ingenuity of the private sector to augment government efforts to keep space accessible and stable. What is the appropriate level of government oversight necessary to ensure commercial entities are well integrated into a comprehensive rules-based framework? How should the administration incorporate them into a future defense space strategy?
Thank you, Congressman Wilson. On the commercial space, there's a number of places going on. First of all, with respect to your question, kind of touched on regulation in one respect. And there was a major overhaul of commercial remote sensing regulation that took place in the past year, which DoD worked very closely to really bring us out of the 2006 era of the old regulation into the 2020s era, where we have much more prolific commercial capabilities, and we need to let that competitive sector compete around the world. And the Defense Department benefits from having that strong commercial sector. So a big change in the philosophy there. We also, of course, leverage U.S. commercial space innovation. Our space launches off of commercial launch service providers, for example. There's growing commercial space situational awareness capabilities that we interleave with our own capabilities. And so depending on the sector, we use more or less. There's some areas where commercial doesn't find a great market, so we have to put more government investment. Other places like satellite communications, tremendous opportunity to leverage commercial.
Well, it's exciting to see the mutual benefit. And Mr. Turner, the June 2020 Defense Space Strategy includes several lines of effort, one of which is to better inform international and public audiences of the growing adversarial threats in space. What can Congress do to ensure that our constituents understand the benefits of an accessible, stable space?
Sorry, I'm sometimes I forget to unmute. Today's hearing is one such step, I think, because this is available on live streaming, so presumably others besides all of us can hear what's going on. I think Americans need to be made aware of how much they actually depend on space for their not only for their security but also for their prosperity. We do a certain amount of outreach as well, which is very effective in that regard. And of course, I think one of the things that ensures that this will reach the right audiences is that thus far our efforts in space have been supported by a bipartisan consensus in Congress. And it's sort of like, the old saying that domestic policy ends on America's shores. I think it also needs to end where we start to leave the atmosphere and get into outer space. So I'll leave it at that for right now.
No, thank you very much. And indeed, Chairman Cooper is leading the bipartisanship. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Now, Mr. Garamendi, are you still with us? Mr. Garamendi? If not, Mr. Issa? Are you still with us? We will.
No, I'm with you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Daryl, go for it.
I think I'm going to continue pretty much with the same line of questioning that we've been doing, but I'll change it up a little bit. General, I think maybe you can handle this sort of as a joint representative. In the domains that we have operated on during your career, sea, land, air, we have international rules and conventions, and they're broadly agreed to and signed on by all the parties that we've mentioned here today. Would you say that's fair to say?
Yes, sir, I would.
And as we sit here today, we will have today, tomorrow, or certainly last week, and in the next 3 weeks, we'll have Iranian gunboats that will enter our space and endanger ships. We may or may not have another taking of our maritime folks. And of course, China is building islands and in complete violation of right-of-ways for countries throughout that region is beginning to encroach or to not allow people to have what has been hundreds of years of free travel. So would you say that as we look to space, is there any special reason not to believe that all of the factors that affect air, land, and sea around our hemisphere, that any of those will be significantly different? In other words, can we not expect at least similar activities as we have similar bad actors or the same bad actors who are already in space, such as China and Russia?
Mr. Congressman, thank you for the question. Certainly, I think those analogies are useful, but if we push them too far, of course, analogies will start to break down because there is sovereign maritime space, there's sovereign airspace. There is no sovereign space in space. And so there are some differences that we'll work through, but we certainly believe in Space Force that the establishment of voluntary, non-legally binding norms of responsible behavior will help us to identify when others are acting outside of those norms and when they're acting irresponsibly. Much like when we're on the interstate and everyone's following the rules, you can quickly see who those are that are dangerous and not following the rules. So we do think that would be a very positive step for the space domain.
And I agree with you. And as a follow-up, and I do agree that there's certainly sovereign space, but using the 2007, in which China demonstrated its ability to destroy a satellite in deep space, albeit its own, but for the purpose of showing us that there, but for their good graces, that could have been one of our satellites or a number of them. That activity certainly was outside of any reasonable interpretation of their sovereign rights. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, it certainly was irresponsible, Mr. Congressman, with 3,000 pieces of debris left on orbit that we continue to track 14 years after the fact, 10% of all the trackable objects on orbit. I can't imagine what led them to do that and to continue to pollute the domain and put us all at risk.
So the history of our planet being at relative peace for the last half of the last century was primarily through a combination of international agreements and a degree of enforcement that the United States and its allies, notably NATO and others, enforced with a periodic enforcement by the United Nations. So in remaining time, if you could answer sort of one of those great questions for all time, isn't it fair to say that we must go forward and establish those international rules, draw in as many convention signers, including potential bad actors, as possible, but also form those alliances that would mimic in space, if necessary, the same sort of alliances that have in fact kept us relatively peaceful for the last 70 plus years? Don't we sort of have to do all of them? Produce the UN, produce the agreements, but also build those alliances with the expectation that just as in the past, the future, there will be those who will not respect the very agreements that they've signed.
Mr. Congressman, we've certainly seen NATO recognize space as a warfighting domain in just the last couple of years. And so we see many of our like-minded countries that we operate with putting more and more interest and concern on space. And that, I think, accrues to our benefit because we can now coalesce around these norms of responsible behavior. And as those begin to establish, then our State Department colleagues can maybe work further agreements down the road. But I think it's only goodness to bring more and more allies and partners into these discussions.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. I would like to give General Whiting the opportunity to clarify something. I think you may have left the impression that so far there's not much that's sovereign in space, when I would say that each individual nation's capsules or astronauts are in fact sovereign entities, even though they're traveling through space.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was specifically referring to the physical space itself, which is in the outer space domain, not to man-made objects that are put on space. So thank you for that clarification.
Thank you. Mr. Garamendi?
I stepped away for a moment. Clearly, we have a situation in which, on the military side of it, space is a domain for war, and unfortunately, we are all, not just the United States, China, and Russia, but others, rapidly militarizing space with the anticipation that there could be trouble in the future, and it happens to create an extraordinary risk when all of our countries are dependent upon space for early knowledge of what the other may be doing. I'm going to leave that aside. Mr. Issa went into it in some detail. I want to deal with the commercial side of it. We're seeing a very rapid evolution of commercial activity in space for many different reasons. Almost so that our military no longer depends solely on itself for highly detailed photos of what's going on in the world, weather reporting, and on and on. So let's talk about norms on the commercial side of the activity, putting aside for a moment the military side, for which I suspect the norm is he who is strongest will win at the end of the process, and we'll all be dead. But let's go ahead for a moment on the commercial side. Start wherever you want. Let's go with DOD. What is your interest in the commercial? And then to the other two witnesses, ending up with the State Department.
Congressman Garamendi, very much interested in that. I think a good example of DOD and the commercial community working with respect to norms has been the sponsorship that the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency did with the group. The acronym was CONFERS. I'm sorry, I forget the name of the acronym, but it described a body bringing together commercial people with government to talk about how to do on-orbit servicing and rendezvous and proximity operations, and figuring out what are the proper ways to do this. When do you need to have permission? It's a user community interest group, and if you think back long time in history, the International Telecommunications Union kind of started out in that same way, community of interest coming together on it. I think it's sort of pulling off on its own. The commercial community will probably be taking more of the lead in that. But that's the kind of example where we will partner with the commercial community to figure out how do we encourage the stakeholders to take on the public, the interest of the commons.
Thank you very much.
Congressman Garamendi, if I may jump in as well, just to
Please.
say, as has been mentioned earlier in the hearing today, one of the difficulties we face is that, of course, with Russia and China, there really aren't commercial activities. They are state-run, state-supported activities. When it comes to the United States, where we have such amazing commercial partners like SpaceX and Blue Origin, exactly the ones that have allowed us to get to the ISS without having to rely on Russia, they operate at very high standards, and we support those standards. They help set the standards for the rest of the world. And of course, again, through the Artemis Accords, working with those values, that vision, and those standards, other countries and their potential commercial space operators are very interested in joining part of that process. One of the problems with the COPUOS process is that there are over 90 countries in it, and it does all of its work by consensus. So unless everyone agrees, nothing gets done. When it comes to commercial space operators, the United States sets the standard, and we are working very actively, bilaterally, and in broader fora to make that the standard for the world.
Thank you. Anybody else want to jump in on this?
Just briefly, again, this is Bruce Turner again. Just to say, building on what Jonathan Moore just said, I mean, there are opportunities there, of course. When our commercial sector leads, you start to set these standards. Those become the tacit standards for everyone. And then countries such as Russia and China are maybe forced to sort of deal with those standards as well, and then would apply them to their own efforts. So that, again, is one of the advantages of developing these systems of norms.
Thank you. I will just end in 20 seconds. It seems to me that on the military side, we're not going to get very far. It's always good to talk, and the more talk is better. On the commercial side, building on what Mr. Issa said about allies on the military side, working to use our current leadership and develop a commercial set of standards and then allow the others to join would be very, very fruitful. Mr. Cooper, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. The next four questioners will be Mr. Moulton, Mr. Waltz, Mr. Carbajal, and Mr. Brooks. So now, Mr. Moulton.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I want to continue on a consistent theme throughout this hearing, which is on effective enforcement. Without effective enforcement, rules and norms obviously limit our own activity in space, but do nothing to impede malign activity by our adversaries. So let me be clear, I'm not suggesting a rules-based order in space is not a goal worth pursuing, but I want to ensure that this is not an empty or symbolic endeavor. If we do not intend to enforce the, quote, voluntary, non-legally binding rules or expect our adversaries to abide by norms in space, what happens when they violate them?
Thank you for calling me.
I could not do it. Daryl Mindy?
Oh, sorry. We see this issue in cyberspace. We've got international actors who are still emboldened to attack and hack into U.S. networks without any fear of an effective penalty or retribution. And so, yeah, we can name and shame to a certain extent, but what are the real consequences of setting down rules that are then going to be ignored? And how do we actually respond and deal with this more effectively?
Those are some very good questions. It's always a very complicated issue. Compliance with whether it's legally binding obligations in the case of treaties, or whether you're talking about politically binding, non-legally binding commitments in other areas. Each one has its advantages and its disadvantages. The advantage of a treaty is that it's a legal obligation, so that in some ways you could argue that a violation is more straightforward, except if you've ever worked with a lawyer, you would know one of the things that you get into is you get into these very, very difficult and complicated interpretations of what the treaty actually says, and that can be also a very long process. One of the advantages of just because it's not a legally binding norm does not mean that it's not a norm, and does not mean that you cannot call somebody out for violating that norm, nor does it mean that you can't take potential action if an actor is not complying with that particular norm. In some cases, you may even have more flexibility to react in those kinds of situations precisely because it's not a legally binding agreement. And then lastly, I would just add that with all of these kinds of norms, even when certain actors violate those norms, they often pay a price for doing so. And in today's social media environment or media environment, whatever you want to call it, where so much depends on the narrative of who's doing the right thing and who's not doing the right thing, that can still be useful, a useful way to put diplomatic and public pressure on malign actors.
I mean, I'm actually, Mr. Turner, one of the few members of Congress who's not a lawyer, but it seems to me that this just has to be a lot more clear. And, hoping that one of our adversaries will get shamed on social media does not seem like an effective strategy here. General, I've got a question for you on this same theme. So a rules-based order in any domain requires a certain level of transparency and trust. And I understand that there is a current effort by U.S. Space Force and space policy to review potential declassification of satellites and activity in space to be more transparent and to publicly communicate about our space operations more easily. How are you integrating with this effort to ensure that we have enough transparency to allow for verification of our own behavior while still protecting systems and activity that we are not prepared to share?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Congressman, for that question. Certainly, I would say that I think we are the most transparent country when it comes to our activities in space through the website that I mentioned earlier, spacetrack.org, that we make available to the world because we care about preserving the domain for our long-term operations there. And we have had an effort ongoing for the last several years to continually even make more information available. Of course, just like in other domains, we're not going to show exactly where our ships and airplanes are that are critical to the national defense.
If I may interrupt, do we think we have that balance right, or are we still on the side of too much of it being classified to be effective at using the transparency we need to promote enforcement?
Mr. Congressman, I would say it's not an end state, it's a journey. And so I think we're constantly working to get that balance exactly right. I think we've made important strides, and we'll continue to do those reviews to make as much information as possible to as many people as possible to ensure the domain is safe.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Waltz, are you with us? Mr. Waltz? Calling Mr. Waltz. If he's not, Mr. Carbajal.
Here I am.
Now we
Sorry,
can.
I'm having glitches here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I apologize for the technical difficulties I was having. One of the most pressing issues to be addressed is obviously debris mitigation. The Space Force is tracking about 30,000 pieces of debris with 500,000 other objects in orbit, too small to track. While the Space Debris Mitigation Guidelines of the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space was endorsed by the United Nations General Assembly in 2007, RAND recently reported that the voluntary guidelines lack measures for accountability and that compliance with debris mitigation guidelines, and it is the biggest contributor to greater collision risk. General Whiting, based on the current level of space debris and voluntary international policies, will there be a point where there will be an unacceptable risk posed by space debris to the United States space assets, including both national security and commercial operations?
Mr. Congressman, thank you for the question. I certainly want to communicate that we are concerned about the growing congestion in space, but I think certainly over the next several years, we have plans and processes in place to make sure that we can continue to safely operate, but we do support intergovernmental measures that will reduce debris, and I'll defer to my colleague, Mr. Hill, maybe to speak more about what the Department of Defense is doing in that regard.
Mr. Hill?
Yes, sorry, there was a little noise. So we, in 2019, the United States government updated our orbital debris mitigation standard practices. They actually go well beyond what the United Nations practices are. And in fact, they drew from a lot of Department of Defense and existing regulations, providing much clearer statements of the hazard risks, more options for how to get debris out of orbit, particularly from higher orbits over time. But there is absolutely, as General Whiting said, concern, and particularly in the low Earth orbit region, where things get crowded in some of the polar orbits in particular, that debris mitigation is important. The emergence in the commercial sector and in some government support, some places of potentially active debris removal is encouraging, but I think there is a lot of work to be done in this respect.
Thank you very much. General Whiting, in your testimony, you write that some discussions at the mill-to-mill level can be challenging, but more often than not, there is agreement on what constitutes responsible behavior. The ability to demonstrate and message responsible behavior and desire to call out irresponsible behavior. At the mill-to-mill level, what has been the biggest barrier to moving forward with creating an international accepted framework?
Mr. Congressman, each of the countries that we have mill-to-mill discussions with, and these are allied countries, they all have their own legal frameworks, they have their own policy traditions, and we work through those in forums like the Schriever War Games tabletop exercise that we conduct every year. But through that, we find there is a coalescing around some generally accepted ways of operating that are responsible, safe, professional. And so we think through dialogue, we can work through those kinds of issues.
Thank you. Mr. Turner and Mr. Moore, commercial companies are heavily investing in satellites and launch services. Space technology these companies are developing has the propensity to be dual use, which creates new challenges. Is the federal government engaging with commercial actors as part of your discussions in developing rules and norms And can you comment on how dual technology is being considered?
I mean, I think I would defer to my colleague from OES on the commercial aspects of that. But from a security standpoint, of course, this is one of the issues with developing rules of behavior. And one of the issues when you're talking about threats in space is we're very acutely aware of the fact that a number of things are dual use simply by nature. So they can either have benefits or they can potentially be used against satellites. So it's one of those issues that needs to be talked about, and again, why we are in favor of these rules of behavior.
Yes, Congressman Carbajal, Bruce touched exactly on some of the aspects of dual use. We are very much trying to support the development of the commercial sector. And again, this is a place where companies in the United States are leading the way and setting the standard, helping again to return us to ISS so that we're not dependent on other countries for that. But as part of the broader efforts, including through the Artemis Accords, to build partnerships and to share values and vision on space, where again, we're very grateful for the strong endorsement of this administration for those goals. That is part of the discussion with the commercial sector.
Thank you very much. I'm out of time. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman is, in fact, out of time. We tried to get Mr. Waltz earlier. He was not available. Mr. Brooks was next, and he has logged off. So I think the next questioner will be Mr. Liu.
Thank you, Chairman Cooper and Chairman Castro, for holding this important hearing. I am very thankful for the expertise from all the panelists today. I previously served an active duty in the Air Force, and now I do my reserve duty at the Space and Missile Systems Center at Los Angeles Air Force Base. And I'm thrilled that the United States Space Command has chosen to locate Space Systems Command, one of three major commands under the Space Force, at Los Angeles Air Force Base. And with every passing day, space becomes more important. I also wanted to just clarify the critical infrastructure question that Congressman Langevin asked earlier. The reason there's been confusion is there's approximately 16 critical infrastructure sectors, such as the chemical sector, the communications sector, the energy sector. Space is not one of them. However, if there is, for example, a space communications satellite that would arguably be captured within the communications sector that's been designated as critical infrastructure, to alleviate this confusion and to capture everything in space, I'm working on legislation that would in fact designate space as an infrastructure sector. And that goes in line with both the former administrations and this administration's focus on space. And so my first question is to Secretary Moore. I note, first of all, that you speak at least 8 languages, so I'm super impressed by that. But I also note that your title doesn't include space anywhere in it. At the same time, the Department of Defense has created an entire space force dedicated just to space. Do you think it's a good idea, or shouldn't we have the State Department elevate space to a standalone bureau?
Congressman Liu, thank you very much for your service, both in uniform and in the House of Representatives, and thank you for an excellent question. I'm very pleased to tell you that across the list of endeavors in the Bureau of Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs, we have 9 action offices. One is the Office of Space Affairs. It is staffed by a number of diplomats and professional experts with advanced degrees, including in astrophysics. It is the core team that coordinates diplomatic efforts on space with other countries in lockstep with the Pentagon, with Space Command, of course, with NASA. And congratulations to Administrator Nelson on his recent confirmation. We have a very distinguished team. The word space may not appear in our title, but because of the tasks that we have here in the Bureau, which has a fairly long name as it stands, I can assure you that space is front and center. For all of these reasons, we're grateful for the opportunity to testify today and respond to not just your questions today, but to work with you and your staff, as we have done in the past and with many offices in Congress, to help explain and gain information and guidance from you.
Thank you. I just request that you and others at the State Department consider having space not just as an office, but as a separate bureau. My next question goes to General Whiting. Thank you for your service as well, sir. So we have currently other countries such as China and Russia who don't necessarily follow norms. And as you know, China has done anti-satellite weapons tests. So we could have two possibilities. Either we allow all countries to do anti-satellite weapons testing, or we allow no country to do it through a binding legal regime. Do you have any preference for that from a defense perspective? Do you think the U.S. should be allowed to do anti-satellite tests as other countries do, or should no country be allowed to do that as a legal matter?
Thank you, Mr. Congressman, for the question. From my perspective, the real danger with those tests, and we're talking about tests now, are the long-lived debris like the Chinese ASAT debris that we continue to have to operate around today. I think we do absolutely want to establish a norm that no actions in space, no country's action in space should create long-lived debris. And with that, sir, I would defer to Mr. Hill on questions of legality regarding ASAT tests.
Mr. Liu, if you to pick up on from what General Whiting just said, in terms of tests, you're correct. There is no prohibition today on anti-satellite tests. There is quite a bit of scorn to be earned, as China earned in 2007 with their test. The question, though, if you were to try and prohibit weapons in space is what is the definition of a weapon, and when are these systems, which they are so inherently dual use? Lasers can be used for communications, lasers can be used as weapons, and it goes on from there. So it's the practicality, it's the verifiability, enforceability of that. And so what we really have to focus on in the long run is reducing the benefits that people might seek to derive from employing capabilities as weapons. That goes to resilience and to mission assurance, which is a longer topic.
Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. I did not know that Mr. Moore was so multilingual, but I did notice from the video that he has the largest office of anyone on the call. So congratulations on that. Mr. Waltz is back, so now it's Mr. Waltz's turn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, everyone. Mr. Hill, as an OSD alum, it's great to see you in this capacity. It's been a long time. I want to ask you about thinking through how we establish deterrence in space. And as many of you have said, and many of my colleagues have said, our entire modern economy could be greatly adversely impacted should some of these assets be taken down. But as we're seeing the Chinese in particular increase their reliance as Baidu comes online, their GPS system comes online, their military increasingly projects and is also becoming increasingly dependent. How do we establish deterrence in space? I know the vice chairman is working on a declassification effort, but I want them to know what we can do and what we can't do and what we're willing to do as a deterrent measure. What efforts are there along those lines? Mr. Hill, I'll go to you first, but anyone feel free to answer.
Congressman Waltz, it is good to see you again after many years. So deterrence in space, we spend quite a bit of focus on this. And as I started to mention in my previous response, for a nation that is highly dependent on space, both in our civil life, our daily commercial life, private lives, as well as in our military life, it is fundamentally important. It should be a norm to have reliability, mission assurance of capabilities at a level commensurate to the level on which we rely on those capabilities. That was the case when we didn't have adversary threats in space. And when systems were first designed, you had to design for the natural environment threats, you had to design for jamming, and you did that. But as these more modern conventional threats have emerged, we obviously have to transition our architectures. And this goes back to some of the commercial points earlier, leveraging the innovation that is coming out of the commercial sector and the significant cost reductions that we see in both launch and in the space capabilities themselves allows us to do entirely different architectural approaches. It takes time to transition to that. So you have to protect what you have today, but you ultimately transition to architectures that are more inherently vulnerable. And as in any other domain, you have the ability to accept and survive combat casualties. That's a key part of denying the benefit of attack. With respect to the other side of deterrence, the cost imposition side of things, that's one where you may be looking a lot more across domain types of activities. It may be that the place to impose costs on somebody for an unacceptable activity may not be in the space domain. It may be elsewhere. So those are some of the things to think about with respect to.
Well, what I'm trying to get at, and maybe your State Department colleagues are better to answer this, is what are we communicating that we are willing and capable to do? Because if that's how misjudgments, miscalculations happen. And so that's to your State Department colleagues, what are we communicating now? What are in terms of our capability and our will?
Yeah, this is Bruce Turner from ABC again. One of the reasons we had a meeting in July with the Russians about space issues was to communicate very clearly to them the kinds of concerns that we have about things that they are doing. And this is for the same reason the Biden administration is interested in beginning strategic stability dialogue with the Russians that will cover, nuclear and other issues as well. But the whole point is to explain very clearly to them, what our concerns are, what we do not want them to do, and to try to iron out some of these rules of the road so that they know exactly what kinds of risks they're taking if they engage in certain kinds of behavior.
So, and the thing, one of the things that I'm most concerned about is our nuclear command and control systems. And when we're talking about standards in terms of how close you can get, what types of activities you can do now that other countries are up in geosynchronous, I think we need to be very clear on our end, but also make it clear on their end so we don't have those kind of catastrophic miscommunications. Mr. Chairman, my time has expired and I yield. Thank you.
I appreciate the gentleman being so precise. Thank you. We've completed, I think, the first round of questioning, and I was going to cut it off. We've been in session for about an hour and 45 minutes. Are there any members who have a final question they would like to ask? If not, then I want to thank the witnesses for their excellent testimony. I want to thank the members for showing up and posing such good questions. And I want to thank the staff for assembling all this. So it's hard to have a remote hearing, but this went very well. And it's certainly an important and possibly historic hearing that we had today to get these efforts underway. So thank you for being part of this historic effort. The hearing is,
Mr. Chairman.
The hearing is now adjourned with Chairman Castro's permission.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone.
The hearing